Good afternoon. Welcome to the Summit's afternoon session. My name is Rich Harmon. I am a director here at CER. My day job, I run the investment banking education practice at BB&T. We've got a couple of my colleagues here. I'd like to introduce Greg. Would you like to stand up? Greg McKenna, who runs our Pittsburgh office. I think Griffin Bradley, I think we have her working up at the front desk helping out. A few things about the capital markets. They remain very healthy. Interest rates, long-term fixed interest rates are in that 4 to 6% range. And for the very few people in this room that are my age, that's still pretty good cost of capital. We're seeing lots of inflows, new and diverse sources of funds coming to this sector. I think that's very indicative of the health of this movement and innovation in general. Actually, there's a new fund. There's a couple of new charter school specific funds that have been started this year. Couple things before I turn it over to our panelists. I'd like to thank Jeannie and Jackie and their management team for the great work that they do. I say that on behalf of the board here at CER, and also and most importantly, the work that they've done here to make this summit and gala tonight such a great success. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here with us at this summit and your support of our organization. So with that, I look forward to meeting people tonight. Enjoy the rest of the session. I'll turn it over to people a lot smarter than I am.
Well, thank you. That's a lot of pressure here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think when you're at the beach, there'd be a lot of other compelling things that might entice you. So we very much appreciate you staying with us. And we've got what we hope a lively discussion for this afternoon about higher education and where it is today and the connection between education and some of the things we talked about at lunch with the governor, how it is meeting the needs of consumers and students and the needs of the workforce. I'll say a few words. I'm Carol D'Amico, Executive Vice President at Strata Education Network. And part of my responsibilities are to work with the work that Bill Hansen talked about at lunch, and that's our work with Gallup on what we call consumer insights. Every day we listen to 350 adults in the United States tell us about their experiences, perceptions, hopes and dreams about education and their pathways to careers. And I'll just set the stage for our discussion here this afternoon. We're learning a lot. Bill said some of it. But we're learning that by and large consumers, and we say consumers, we're talking about students, prospective students, past students, believe that higher education is important, though they are, they're losing some confidence in higher education. We know that the vast majority of people engage in higher education for one reason, and one reason only, and that is to get a better career outcome. There's not even a close second. But when you ask them, was that goal achieved for you, only about a third say that it was. Bill talked about this level of regret. Over 50% of people who've engaged in higher education and actually managed to complete it regret one aspect of their decision, whether it was their major, what college they selected, or what degree they selected. And that's a big investment. And it's very difficult to undo your education experience. You can undo other major investments you make in your life. You can buy a new car that you didn't like your car you bought. You can buy a new house. It's expensive and inconvenient, but I've done it. Bought a house I didn't like, I bought another one. You can even change your life partner you chose. I have not done that, but plenty of people do. But to redo and undo your education is a very difficult thing to do. And so one of the things we talk about at Strata is how do we mitigate that sense of regret of people who have spent a lot of time and money and have found that experience lacking for them. We also know that though everyone, by and large, 80% of people believe that it's a very important thing to do to go to higher education, Gallup asked this question: if your job was eliminated today due to technology, where would you turn for retraining? And half the people said, my employer, and less than a third said, my local college or university. So I'm going to be asking panelists, what does this mean? Bill also talked about the confidence that employers have. About 11% of employers today think that higher education is producing the kind of graduate that's needed in the workplace. But you compare that to academic provosts, and it's over 95%. There is a perceptions gap, a reality gap about how well prepared people are for the workforce once they have participated. So we're finding out a lot of things about higher education and consumers' perceptions about it, but we are finding some solutions along the way. That relevance, no matter, if you thought you had a relevant experience, and that is related to your everyday life, related to the career that you're engaged in, you are much more likely to think it was a satisfying, fulfilling experience. And that just makes sense, that people go for that career outcome, and if they in fact achieve it, then they are much more satisfied. So part of the title of this panel was, what is the relationship between education and careers? So I've got lots more things I could say about what we're learning, but I wanted to set the stage for a very lively discussion with our panelists. I'm told that we don't have to introduce them, that you all know who they are, but I'm going to have them say, as we go around here, is just a word or two about who they are and their day jobs. But I'm going to ask a very beginning, opening question. Higher education is in great transition. We've spent a lot of time today talking about K-12 in a state of crisis. But are we in that state today with post-high school education? Has the consumer lost confidence? And consumer can be the consumer of the education or the employer, general public. But are we where K-12 was 25 years ago? And do we need an aggressive set of reforms to reform our higher education in the US? So I hope that's enough to stimulate some discussion of this very shy, retiring panelist. Daniel, why don't you go first?
You stole my line.
Oh, I didn't know it. I didn't.
It was my line. We need to. Okay. So, thank you, Carol. So, Daniel Pianco, University Ventures. We back transformative entrepreneurs who are changing the face of higher education and in education to employment. And I got involved in the charter movement when I left Goldman Sachs, and 20 plus years ago. And what we saw when we were starting charter schools was we were replacing dropout factories of the blob, as Governor Bush called them. 20 years later, the students that we started to serve in charter schools are now going to college. And we have suddenly woken up to the fact that graduation rates from higher education are just as bad, if not worse, than those that we were trying to replace. So we created a whole generation of charter schools with the sole goal of getting kids to college, and then 20 years later we realized they're dropout factories too. And so as we think about what CER could be for the 21st century, and if I were a policymaker looking at this world, I would be trying to figure out how do we create the pathways to employment that effectively answer Carol's fundamental problem, which is 90+% of people who go to higher education do so to get a better job. And let's take the politics out of it for a second, because I agree. Right now, higher ed should be the tricycle avoiding the, what was his analogy at lunch? The trike avoiding traffic. Right now, we have a unique opportunity from a federal and a state level to actually bring into play faster, cheaper pathways to employment that solve a lot of things. And I actually think it should be starting with charter schools. And I can talk a little bit about more with some of the work we're doing with some of the largest charter school networks in the country. But that's how I would set this up, which is we need to bring the energy and verve and vigor that we've brought to K-12 system for the last 25 years and bring that to higher ed next.
And I am Brian Jones from Strayer University. And I suppose I come at this with something of a dual perspective. I work in higher ed, but I also chair the authorizing board of charter schools in DC for 4 years. And so really, I think have seen the role of innovation in K-12 and in higher ed. And I'm not sure, Carol, I would say that we are where K-12 was 25 years ago. I don't think I'd give K-12 that much credit. But I do think that we are at an inflection point in higher ed. And I think it's an exciting time because certainly the ability of data analytics and just, I think, beginning to understand more about student demand, student need, really is beginning to transform higher ed nicely. I have been a long-time fan of Strada's work and Brandon here. He doesn't know it, but I've been stalking his work for years. And I'm envious that my friend Andy here has lured him away from it. But I do think that critical, what all of that work that Strada and Brandon have done over the years, underscoring what I think too many higher ed leaders have not been willing to embrace. And that is, as Carol noted, the vast majority of students today are simply looking for a pathway to improve their economic prospects, their life prospects. And so I lead an institution of 50,000 students. Average age is 35. About 60% of our students are people of color. About 65% of our students are first-gen college students. And we know very well that they come to us with a very practical demand. So what we've done over a series of years is a few things. Number one, we have really transformed the way we think of ourselves. You talk to my team at Strayer, and you will hear we think of ourselves and our work as being engines for social and economic mobility. Everything that we do is organized around that principle. And if what we're producing is not moving the needle on mobility, then we're failing in our work. So what does that mean? So on some level, it means that we work very closely with employers so that we understand what employer demands are in the marketplace. We don't want to be educating students in an outcomes vacuum. So, for example, we actually teach in Verizon facilities around the country. I often say I am probably the only college president in America who has done ride-alongs with FedEx salespeople, who has worked on Main Street in Walt Disney World to better understand their guest relations needs. And what that means is we have partnered with big American companies really to try to understand at a granular level what their skill needs are and how we can improve our offerings to meet those needs. And then overlaying all of that, and this gets back to that Strata Gallup work, we also know that to do our work well, we really have to be just consumer obsessed. And that means not only having great data about our students and our market, but also really making sure that we're out talking to students and alums, engaging alums in the life of the university, and really trying at what Jeff Bezos would say, really understanding our customer at an intrinsic level, so that we not only meet their needs today, but we can begin to anticipate what their needs may be in the future. And so with today's state of surveys, data analysis, and other technology, as well as our employer insights, I'm excited about the path forward.
Good. I'm Andy Rosen. I'm the CEO of Kaplan. And I want to go back to the original question, which is, are we today where K-12 was 25 years ago? I actually think it's kind of the opposite. Higher ed is where, ironically, is where organizations like CER want K-12 to be. That is, Jeannie Allen has been this warrior for choice, and at higher ed, we have choice. There is no student in the country who has to go to a particular university. They can choose among any institution that will accept them. So this is great. I mean, you have exactly what Jeannie has been fighting for all these years, what Governor Bush has been fighting for, which is give the power to the student and their families as to where to go. So you would think, if that's the holy grail, why is higher ed so problematic? And this is where I think the K-12 community needs to understand, I think they do, is choice alone doesn't lead to great offerings for students. Because culture actually is every bit as important as choice. And in higher ed, there is a very strong culture to look as much like Harvard or Stanford as you can. Now, if you're much further down the food chain, you're not trying to look like Harvard, but if you're Guilford, you're trying to look like Davidson. If you're Davidson, you're trying to look like Wake Forest. If you're Wake Forest, you're trying to look like Duke. And if you're Duke, you're trying to look like Harvard. But it's not, what that does is there's this notion in higher ed that sometime, you could say it was in the 1920s, you could say it's in the 1950s, but we achieved perfection in the delivery of education. And once you decide that we have achieved perfection, then anything that varies from that perfection is by definition worse. So any innovation within higher ed is met with skepticism because it's varying from this idealized sense that higher ed is outstanding. So, at conferences like this, everybody always talks about Michael Crow and what a great job he's doing at Arizona State. Now, in any other industry, you'd have this guy who's taken a university from really the middle ranks to being the most innovative institution in the country, who's taken the reputation of Arizona State and put it on the top, not just in national perception, but in global perception. And everybody would be following him. And that would become, everything that Arizona State is doing would become table stakes because, of course, everybody's got to do that and you got to get better. But that doesn't happen in higher ed. In fact, what happens is you try to ring fence Michael Crow and Arizona State and say, well, that's, first of all, it's highly suspicious, probably dangerous, and let's just wait and see. Maybe let's give it 10 or 20 years and see whether it makes sense. And so you've got individual innovators in higher ed for sure. I think Strayer is among them. I like to think that Purdue Global, which is the institution that we support, and Purdue itself are among them. Where there are people who are doing really remarkable things. But it is higher ed, and I think K-12 has some of these same characteristics. It's not a market where you see something good and you and you go with it. You know, going back to the strata, because it sounds like we're all required to go back to strata data.
That was the point. So,
But Strata,
right, Brandon?
Strata and Gallup said that if you have a mentor in college, if somebody even just asks, you know, says to you, by the way you worked on this assignment, that's the kind of work that will make you more effective in a job. If you just say that, at some point in your 4 years, you're much more likely to be engaged in your job and to be better going into the workforce. Something, I'm paraphrasing, but something like
Yeah,
that, right?
I mean, it's not a heavy lift
Not a heavy
for
lift.
faculty to make some minor connection.
So why
Yeah.
isn't every university emphasizing to their faculty, you've got to reach out to students and make sure that they are speaking to students in language that helps them understand the relevancy of what they're doing to the work world. That is so easy. It doesn't cost a penny. Not happening, because higher ed works on a different set of goals. If you want to become, if you're a provost and you want to become a president, you have to make your institution look more like Harvard. If you're a president who wants to go to a bigger school, you got to make sure your institution looks more like Harvard. And until we shift that culture, choice alone is not going to give us the kind of higher education system that we're looking for. Pass it on to you, Richard.
Thank you. My name is Richard Keatoney. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Area 9, an education software company. We've been in business for about 20 years. We've educated about 15 million students globally. We're a Danish company. Before that, I've worked at the 3 largest publishing houses for 20 years, making software of different scales. And to the specific question, I think that it's a tough thing to solve. And at one of the jobs I had, I headed strategy at one of the largest publishing houses, and I was in charge of evaluating and meeting with 880 startups in the ed tech space, all of whom had found the greatest light switch cover solution you've ever seen, and they all had the China solution, which was, there are 1 billion people in China. If I got every one of them to give me $1, I will be a billionaire. And it's true. And when you start applying general statements and general principles across a complicated problem, the solutions seem very unnuanced and very, very specific to your own point of interest. One of the things our software does for both corporate training and for K-12 and universities, we try to uncover unconscious incompetence, something we all suffer from, right? We are all curious why we're not getting something, yet we don't realize we don't know it. And when you study, so the university problem, I think you're exactly right, even though we agreed that I was going to completely disagree with you. You owe me a beer. So the idea that people are myopically looking at themselves and they alone govern their own change, they're unconsciously incompetent about what they are doing. Those university provosts or presidents or deans not only have a poor infrastructure for measuring what their success factors are, they set their own success factors. And when you do that, it's very easy to say, I look good in this, when you don't. And there isn't a means other than choice for people to say, I'm not going to measure this way. To the point of data and the data you're collecting, Strata data, I think that we collect billions of learning data points, and many other companies do too. The power of data is that if you can address a real problem and not a fictitious one, a meaningful problem, the data is there for you to apply it. And with data, you can drive results and measure them. And it doesn't have to be 20 years. You know, it could be 20 months.
Yeah, I mean, so this issue of, we call them the 4 R's, okay? Who here has gone to college, first of all? Who here went to a top 200 university, okay? Who here has received a fundraising letter in the mail from that university? Okay, all right, 100%. Rarely in a room do you get 100%. I figured here you get it. I virtually guarantee you, every single one of those fundraising letters focused on the 4 R's. We're going to do more research. We're going to build a beautiful building, second R real estate. rankings, we're going to get higher in the rankings. And the fourth R is RA for sports. So research, rankings, real estate, and sports. Every single university focuses on that. Does that have any impact on teaching and learning? No. Okay? And I think actually the Obama administration sort of gave us a gift, and then I think we kind of lost it a little bit, which was this gainful employment rule, which was actually an attempt to. We're going to completely disagree. Come on, let's completely disagree. All right.
Almost turned
So, but wait to hear me out here first.
I stood back.
All right. we all agreed we would try to find a point of disagreement on this panel, so you get the joke.
So,
but
say
if
agree
you
with
think
Kate.
about
They didn't let the moderator in on that.
Yeah. But if you think about what we need to start to do is we have choice in higher ed. What we don't have is any standard that kind of cuts across it about what is quality. And while I can read consumer reports and have a pretty good idea of what car I might want to buy, it's really hard. We don't have a halfway decent ranking system or any kind of system for evaluating quality in higher education besides US News and World Report and the fact that my buddy went to Harvard, so I really want to go there too. And so what I think we lost with some version of a federal standard of minimum viability, which I will call gainful employment, is the ability to say, and I think if you applied it to every institution, you would find that schools like NYU Tisch are just as troublesome for low-income students as the schools that were in the crosshairs of the Obama administration. And what we lost by not sort of figuring out how to apply gainful employment successfully is sort of a base minimum requirement for the return on investment that's required. If you have the capital to go to NYU Tisch, I'm very lucky. My brother-in-law went to NYU Tisch. He got supported a little bit. But all his friends are in real trouble because they got $200,000 in debt, and they're waiters, right? And so I think if we can create some base level minimum of quality metric or return on investment metric, it will go a long way to answer what I think was the underlying tension here, which is we actually have no viable way besides choice, which has not worked in higher ed for the most part, to create alternatives. And so now Andy's going to disagree with me.
No, I really love this line of thinking here. So we've got choice, full choice. You can go anywhere. 3,000 institutions, go to any of them. And there's not really high bars for 99% of them. If you could fog up a mirror, you can get in pretty much because enrollment is really down. So what if there was a performance requirement based on, do people learn, do they get jobs when they leave this college? And here's what they get the jobs in, and here's how much they make. If that was the only performance metric, would that change some of the dynamics we've been talking about?
I would argue that a better metric is not do they get jobs, but really something closer to a mobility measurement. Because I think in some ways,
did they move up their own ladder?
Have they moved up the
their own ladder?
Right.
Did they move up a rung of their own ladder?
Because I do think one of the arguments against a GE type system is there's great diversity among institutions who they serve. It would be meaningless to compare outcomes at my institution with Georgetown, which is down.
But what if they compared within the same? You're not comparing Strayer and Stanford. You're comparing Strayer in its league.
Well, again, I think and this is the way we measure ourselves. So every week I get what we call a student ROI report. We survey students constantly so that we understand where they are when they come in terms of income. We understand where they are then at certain benchmarks after they leave. A year out, 3 years out, 5 years out. And we're getting much better data around those income metrics. And then you combine that with measures of satisfaction and relevance and other things. And then I think you really begin to have a meaningful measure of the value add that a institution provides. And I think that really gets to how you measure an institution. Is it really adding value for students?
Okay.
And again, because students start from so many different places, the expectation for moving them forward is going to vary from institution to institution, or even student by student.
So choice plus this
Right.
metric-driven quality assurance.
Right, right.
You disagree with that,
Well,
Andy?
no, I disagree with Daniel. I just want to be clear about that. But I agree with Brian. I mean, I do think that a measure of the performance of an institution broadly applied would be very helpful to students, because right now it is very difficult to be able to know, between University of Miami or St. Thomas University or Miami-Dade College or Florida Atlantic University, like, who's the better educator? How do you even assess that? How do you even think about that? We know the kinds of students who go into those institutions, and we really evaluate the institutions based on that, but we don't know what kind of value add those institutions are providing. So I think that that would be very helpful. I will say, because we've been a little pessimistic here, that I'm actually very optimistic about the future of higher education, and it's for this reason, and it really is because of choice. What we haven't had up till now is the ability for institutions to really scale. When you're place-based, it requires real estate, it requires students to come here. Now we're seeing the rise of institutions that can be very big. And so if Arizona State has a value proposition for students that is superior to what somebody in New Jersey or in Miami is able to get, Arizona State's going to start to attract that student. And similarly with Strayer, similarly with
Because of the online.
Purdue. Because of online.
Yeah.
Because of online, you're going to be able to get a degree online in a way that you haven't been able to previously. And so you will start to see, and I think we are starting to see, students voting with their feet to go to institutions. So we talk about Arizona State, which is now this behemoth institution. Though every one of those students, beyond the 38,000 who were there in the year 2000, would have otherwise gone someplace else. They have opted to not go to that institution and to go to Arizona State. So the notion of choice in higher ed will ultimately manifest itself because there is a market. And one other thing I would say about these institutions that I think are doing well on the kind of metrics that we talk about, in almost every case, it's because the institutions don't ask the question of what do we do, but they ask why are we here? So again, I'll cite Michael Crow. I mean, I think have I gone 4 times? I think in a panel you're required to mention Michael Crow. At least 4 times.
And do some sort of religious
right,
symbolism
right.
along the way, yes.
For those of you not in higher ed, it's just like an inside joke. Michael Crow is like, the leading innovator. But I coming from Indiana, I have to say Mitch Daniels at Purdue is nothing to sneeze at.
I'm going to get there. But what he said is, why is Arizona State, what did the founding documents say was our purpose for existing? And what he found was, it wasn't driving the economy of the state of Arizona. It wasn't leveling the playing field for the state of Arizona. It was actually reinforcing the imbalances that existed. And he said, as a standard, we're going to have an institution that is more effective at graduating students and getting them into the workforce, and it's going to look demographically like the state of Arizona. And so, because that's why we're here. That's why we exist as a public university. And in doing so, he has vaulted that institution so that it's a much more important part of the Arizona economy. Purdue, with Mitch Daniels, I mean, exactly the reason for the Purdue-Kaplan deal is that Mitch Daniels and the team at Purdue, not just Mitch, but an entire organization, felt very strongly that their duty as a land-grant mission was to serve the 80 million working adults in the United States who didn't have a degree. But those students were not going to come to West Lafayette, Indiana, in order to study. But he felt that in the 21st century, a land-grant institution needs to reach out to those who haven't had access to the real riches of the American higher ed system. And that, plus the feeling that Purdue was behind in online, led him, was the Purdue side of that conversation.
I regret to inform everybody here that I actually think that Andy and Brian agreed with me, right?
Sort of.
And this is the important thing. I don't think gainful employment was horribly drafted, right? So don't take what I said to mean that. But both of them said effectively the same thing, which is if we can create some base level, whether it's value add or something else, and use the context of that rulemaking process, I think that would be hugely value add. And I furthermore would like to say that, like the Mitch Daniels example, okay, one of the things we're most excited about in our portfolio is something called income share agreements. If anybody knows, right now we have a huge student debt crisis, $1.5 trillion. Debt is horrible for students. So Mitch Daniels was the first major college president to adopt income share agreements, which transition from debt to equity. So pay a percentage of your income rather than this student debt that's been really debilitating. I too, like Andy, am very optimistic, and I'll tell you why. I think that the framework, the financing mechanism, this choice mechanism of higher ed, if the entrepreneurs in the charter movement can leverage their innovative models into sort of pseudo higher ed, we can leverage all the funding mechanisms that are already in place. Let me give you a really simple example that we'll work on with a large charter school operator. Imagine a person raises their hand at 17 years old and says, I want to be a doctor. Most people at 17 who say, I want to be a doctor, are not going to become a doctor, whether they're rich, poor, whatever. It's hard to become a doctor. But what they're really saying is, hey, I want to help people in the healthcare setting. So then why don't you create a pathway for students interested in healthcare from 17, from 17-year-old, I think I want to be a doctor, to, all right, first I'm going to get an LPN certificate. Then I'm going to get my associate's degree. Then I'm going to get my bachelor's of science of nursing. And then maybe I'll become an advanced practice nurse. Or maybe I'm going to become a doctor. And the problem we have right now, and this is epitomized in our community college system, is if you raise your hand and say, I want to become a doctor or a nurse, they tell you, that's great, why don't you go major in biology? Biology has nothing to do with becoming a doctor or a nurse. It's just what our advisors in our systems tell you to be. And so what I think is an amazing opportunity for charter operators and for people who are graduating large numbers of 17, 18-year-olds is to start saying, instead of, hey, everyone should go to college, because that's what everyone in this room did, and it worked for us, so we say go to college, and we encourage a generation of charter schools to go to college. Instead, what we should say is, let's figure out the right career pathway for you. And not so much a job, because people actually, 7 of 10 Americans are unhappy in their jobs. What we have is not a jobs crisis. We have the lowest unemployment rate in years. We have a careers crisis. People don't want to be Uber drivers, don't want to work in Amazon distribution centers. They want to be nurses. They want to be accountants. They want to be solving problems, right? And so as we are skeptical of the future because of automation and the future of work not working for us, let's think about all the things that human beings could be incredible at and provide pathways to our 16, 17, 18-year-olds towards those careers.
Well, that's the bridge. I want to get Richard in here before time is running out. I see we've got 3 minutes left. So is there a technology solution to all this we're missing?
I don't think technology has ever been the problem. I think finding an application for technology that's meaningful and beneficial, computers can help us do a lot. We do a lot with our technology just getting data points. But those data points are there to help the teacher, the instructor. One of the biggest challenges, I think, that the last session, I think my favorite part of the last session was Carnegie Seat Time. I think that is the biggest problem that we face because the way that schools were set up were to show that you could learn, that you could persevere. Angela Duckworth is on our board, and she's helping us to try to figure out how computers could help us measure grit. Because that's what the role of the university was meant to do. What we're talking about now is very different, which is retooling. And retooling requires that you have to have some type of rubric or some type of set of skills that you're aligning to a career that then you could make some really innovative structure around. Universities have those in course curriculums, but they silo them. So I think technology is not the problem. I think rethinking how we get out of Carnegie seat time, how we get into a world that allows people to go to a Purdue online, right? The reason ASU has been so successful, in no small part, is because it's transparent. It shows you these are the courses, these are the learning objectives, and these are the jobs that go with these things. And you can either do one or two of them for free, and you can get credit for it if you want. So I think the technology is there. I think the struggle is the funding mechanisms for universities are structured in a way that demand seat time. The mores in the business world are still very much, if you didn't sit through a 4-year degree, how do I know that you know how to learn, you've got the perseverance that I'm looking for? And then once we cross that threshold, then we'll figure out whether or not you even know how a computer works.
So we've only got a minute left, so I'll ask sort of a concluding question as they did, Michael did in the last session. 25 years from now, do you think that higher education will look substantially the same, different than it does today, that when we come for the next anniversary of CER, we'll be having this same discussion in higher ed? And if you think it's going to be substantially different, what is the number one breakthrough you think is going to happen? So you only have a minute. Richard.
There'll be fewer universities. The number will be significantly less, probably by a third.
Wow.
More and more.
Or more.
Or more.
Yeah,
The third of universities will not exist in 25.
I go with the same answer. I think that students are going to choose certain institutions and others are going to go by the wayside.
And I would say the array of credentials will expand. We'll see more short skill-based credentials by greater diversity of providers.
Yeah, Brian stole my thunder. I was going to say that competencies, we're going to not care who your father was, what university you went to, but what competencies you have.
Right.
And we'll have a set of competency-based marketplaces for skills that universities will be an important, but not the sole provider of transitioning to those skills.
Absolutely.
Well, I feel that we've only scratched the surface on this topic. I hope that CER takes up this issue in much more vigorously in the next few years so that we can come and have this conversation again. Maybe not, I won't be here in 25 years, but the conversation can happen.
Oh, yes, you will.
So thank you very much for staying with us.
Thank you very much.